light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. I suppose one of the difficulties of me as an autistic person is that, as one person put it, I'm compulsively honest, and I feel this need to be proactive and respond. And within the current time, that's difficult because it seems like there are so many people who would rather avoid conflict and in so doing settle for all sorts of things that no one should have to settle for. I recall going through a difficulty a number of years ago where I asked somebody, if this were happening to you, you would be very upset and you would be very active. Why is it okay that it's happening to me? And he just stared at me and finally walked away because he didn't have an answer. But he did not, to this day, he's never done anything. And it makes it difficult to think, if I ever meet Mr. Right, how will we ever get together? Because there's a whole list of men I met who are all quite wonderful, and I love them very much. But I don't know how to come to terms with the fact that they stood by and did nothing while I suffered. The words that are thrown around quite a bit are empathy, sympathy, and compassion. Compassion I usually hear described in very active terms. Empathy seems to have to do with really understanding and feeling with the person. Sympathy just means that you're recognizing it as something sad, and that's about as far as it goes. I'm sorry you. Well, the expression I'm often mentioning, and I try not to correct people like I'm the thought police or something, but it's almost amusing when I hear people say it. But only 1 out of 20 times do I ever say anything in response. When I describe to them a challenge I'm wrestling with, something I'm trying to overcome, and the person responds, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." And if I'm quick enough and aggravated enough and not being very polite, I usually respond, "Oh, should I have not told you?" Because they didn't say, "I'm sorry it happened." They said, "I'm sorry to have heard that." And which is where when I'm with people and something comes up, I try to always phrase it as, "I'm sorry that happened to you." But then I always try to follow it with, "Is there anything I can do?" And there was one time when I was at a metaphysical fair with my portable chapel where I said that to someone, and he went silent for a long pause and kind of tipped his head and shrugged, and I just said, "You don't have to think of something if you don't want to, but if there is anything, please let me know." Kind of like when I went to see a doctor once, and all I wanted was a diagnosis, and he provided the diagnosis, and I said thank you, and I kind of empathized with the doctor because it was almost funny. He was having this emotional quandary because he couldn't think of what prescription to write for me, and I said, "No, I don't want a prescription. Thank you for being so concerned about me, but I don't want a prescription. All I wanted was a diagnosis, and you gave me that, so I thank you." But so many doctors today, I'm told, are trained for nothing other than writing prescriptions, and they're pressured by pharmaceutical companies to write prescriptions. But I didn't want a prescription. I wanted a diagnosis, and having that diagnosis, I could then begin to research what is the natural equivalent. Are there natural ways to address this? Is there a different food I should be eating? When someone told me I was having a vitamin B12 deficiency, but because of my autism, I can't crack an egg. It becomes a disaster. It's like every time I go into the kitchen, Murphy's Law goes on overtime. Everything that can go wrong will, and at the worst possible time. Well, it happens 100 times over when I go in the kitchen. So that's where, in terms of food, I use a microwave that uses precise numbers. I use a rice steamer that you put the rice in, when it dings it's done. And I use things that don't have to be cooked, but I can't cook for myself. It requires too much interpretation. But it's, when someone told me I had a vitamin B12 deficiency, I found liquid eggs, I found exactly which dish would work, and I found the right exact time to use in the microwave. And that's how I have liquid eggs 3 times a day in order to have my vitamin B12. And that's how I solve the problem. I don't know that it worked for everyone, but the point is finding an alternative. But what I started with it was not a prescription, but a diagnosis. And so I was empathizing with this doctor. I saw his emotional distress and tried to reassure him, even though I was the patient, he was the doctor. You don't have to feel bad about this. You don't have to write me a prescription. All I wanted was a diagnosis, and you gave me that. You did your job very well. Thank you. It was kind of funny, but it's the difference between the three, because compassion moves you to action. You want to do something. And if you can't do anything, if there's nothing to do, then that simply gets acknowledged. And you let the person know that I'm available if you can think of anything. And empathy is where there's a real emotional involvement. And sympathy maintains distance. That I'm sorry to hear that. Whatever. It dismisses what's going on. It puts a wall between you and them and basically says that if you're going to find a solution, you're not going to find it from them. A sympathetic person does nothing more than recognize the moral nature of what you're experiencing. An empathetic person is with you in that moment. I have a poster, I think it's signed in our heart, and I have no idea who that is, but it's a wonderful poster I hang on my wall. And I recommend it if you can find some version of it. It's something like, and the picture is really immaterial, but the caption is, "And if you cannot find your way out of the dark, I will sit there with you and show you the stars," I think is how it goes. And that when times hurt and there's nothing that can be said that'll make it hurt less, to simply say, I'll be here with you. I mean, it reminds me of the story I heard of the father who wanted to be a good father, but he didn't really know what was going on or how to fix this. And he didn't want to enable a negative behavior, but he didn't want to be disconnected either. So when he got a phone call that I believe it was the son, had been involved in I don't know, it was a drunk driving situation or an accident or something, but the young man had to spend the night in jail. And so instead of coming down and bailing his son out of jail and say, it doesn't matter, you're okay, don't worry about it, don't think about it, he came down to the jail and he sat with his son for the whole night, so that his son had to experience the consequences of his negative behavior, but he didn't have to do it alone. His father, someone who loved him, was there, and they got to spend a whole night sitting next to each other, talking about it and getting to know each other perhaps better than they did, being fully present, being there with empathy. I'm trying to think of what would be a compassionate response to that situation, and I guess it depends on why exactly the son did it in the first place, which I guess raises the question of whether that night of empathy was followed with a day of compassion. That if the son finally told the father what was wrong and why the son did this negative behavior that landed him in jail in the first place, the father then could move on to compassion, from empathy to compassion, and say, have you considered this? How would you like to do that? How would you like to work toward whatever? Whatever is at the basis of that negative behavior, to empathize with the son enough to understand what's going on, and then the two of them together as collaborators to find a way to root out the problem at its source so that it would not happen again. Not just enabling a repetition of the negative behavior, but having empathy to spend the time and having compassion to find the true resolution. Not the quick answer, not the convenient answer, not the easy answer, but the true answer. In my situation, I make do with what I can. And I usually get much further than anyone expects I could. But it was admirable to me recently when I spoke with someone about a particular need, And they immediately knew how to solve it. And I said, oh, you can do that? And they said, yes, you can do that. Or rather, they can do that. I couldn't do it on my own, but they could do it for me, and they were very willing to do it. And I was like, oh, well, that means that things could actually be better in the future instead of being stuck in this place where I am, making do. Every month for me it's a question of what do I do without. And in one sense, I'm glad to have developed the ingenuity, but on the other hand, I wish that I didn't have to. I wish that I could live in a world where everyone's needs are met. And is there something, but when I say that, I'm not saying where we can all become complacent. Because sometimes I recognized long ago that sometimes the reason I experience needs is so that other people will have opportunity. If everyone knew that some version of God would meet all your needs and take care of everything and make it all better and ta-da, there you're all fine. If we knew that, there would be no reason for any of us to take care of each other. It reminds me of the anecdote I read many years ago of a city in World War II that was attempting to recover from the bombing that accompanied World War II, and there are all these buildings that have been knocked down, and they found a statue in a cathedral of Jesus where the statue had fallen over and the hands had broken off. And after much debate, they finally decided to put the statue back without fixing it. And underneath they added a plaque that simply said, Christ has no hands but yours. And in a similar sort of way, there are times where I have to go through horrible losses sometimes in order for those around me to understand that if they don't act, nobody will. That somewhere down the road, there might be some sort of recovery or reward for me. I don't know. If there is, it hasn't happened yet. But the point is that they know that they can make a difference, and that if they don't make a difference, the difference will not be made. And the worst possible outcome will happen. When I speak of a future time, or there's no reason it couldn't be today, except that it depends upon us. Us meaning all of humanity. When I speak of a time where everyone's needs are met, it's not that everyone is making phenomenal sums of money and lives in beautiful houses and there are no needs. It's rather that there are symbiotic relationships, that I make do for this person who makes do for that person who makes do for that person. It kind of reminds me of this wonderful video I saw on YouTube. I think it was called Boomerang Kindness or something like that. But it essentially starts with a young man on a skateboard who is rolling down the street, and he hits something and wipes out on the skateboard and falls down the sidewalk. Well, this construction worker hurries over to help him up and make sure he's okay, and pats him on the shoulder. And so he walks on a few feet, and at the next moment there's an older woman who is having a terrible time trying to carry her groceries home because her arms are getting tired and the bags are so heavy. And the young man sets down his skateboard and carries the bags of groceries across the street for him. Well, then she sees someone else who's digging for change and can't find change for the parking meter. And the older woman pulls out the change and hands it to the woman and says, here's your money for the parking meter. And that woman shakes her head like, why did she help me? But she's walking on a few feet further, and the guy drops his credit card or something, and the woman sees it and grabs it and picks it up and catches up to him and hands it back to him and says, you dropped your card. And the man is like, wow, how nice. And so then he is walking on another few feet, and he sees someone trying to lift this heavy suitcase out of his trunk, and he can't quite get it out. So the guy goes over and helps him lift the suitcase out and shuts the trunk and sets it down and just says, have a nice day, and goes on his way. And the guy with the suitcase notices a homeless man sitting by the street and goes over to the street vendor and buys 2 hot dogs and gives one to the homeless man. And it's just this kindness that keeps going. Then the homeless man helps another woman who forgot her cell phone and quick gives it back to her before she walks away and forgets it. Then that woman buys flowers for a woman who's depressed and having a hard day. Then that woman gives a really big tip to a waiter or a maitre d' who's just had a horrible argument with her boss, letting her know that she's special and she appreciated the good service, so she left this enormously large tip. Well, she's gone before the maitre d' can look around for giving her change. At that point, the maitre d' looks around and sees one more person who needs help and grabs a glass of water and runs out to give water to this construction worker who is working on a hot day, the very first man you see at the beginning of the video. And it's this incredible, wonderful boomerang where it comes back to the person who started it. That sort of thing can happen in everyone's life, but it depends upon paying attention to people around you and doing what you can. You're not offering more than you can, but doing at least what you can. That's compassion. That's not just sympathy. I'm sorry that's happening to you, or I'm sorry you told me, I'm sorry to hear that, and rushing on with whatever your day is. It's not just empathy of, oh, I'm sorry that happened to you, but it's compassion that says, thank you for helping me. You know what I can do for this person? And doing it. I remember when I was in college seeing a movie about Mother Teresa, and I know in some ways she's a very controversial person. But within that movie, the one quote from hers that I do remember is when she makes the comment that it's not about being an incredible person. It's about going to a situation, seeing what you can do, and doing it. And that's essentially sympathy, empathy, and compassion. Going to a situation, fine, you're there. Woohoo. Empathy, where you actually feel something. You're not totally disconnected from your environment and from other people in your environment. And in compassion, where you're acting, you're doing what you can. That it's this action. It's not being an quote innocent bystander. I don't know if there is such a thing, but actually being involved in the symbiotic relationships all around you. Not thinking that the universe revolves around you in some sort of narcissistic or pre-Copernican fashion, but to understand that we are all parts of systems, some of them of which we're conscious and some we're not. That there are systems like the circle of kindness that unless we do our part, it stops and it will never get back to the construction worker who started the whole thing. But because every single one of those people was willing to interact and willing to get involved and do what they could without promising something they couldn't, an entire circle, a closed circle of wonderful good things happened. And that could be in every single one of our days. When I was thinking about what this person said earlier about settling for municipal administrations that are not doing their job correctly or doing it in very self-serving ways and ignoring conflicts of interest and all sorts of things. And I thought, so what do we do to change that? And it's not just getting involved by attending the meetings, that's just a symptom. If you have to go back to the beginning, you have to get to know those people individually and figure out why they're making self-serving choices and how do I encourage this person to be more involved in service to the community and more concerned about all the people in their community, not just themselves. The more they're concerned about only themselves and abusing their power and using their position to benefit only themselves, you're essentially talking about a person who is cut off and isolated, someone who is not receiving the love that they need. If that boy on the skateboard had not been touched by the construction worker, none of those other good things would have happened. It had to go all the way back to the beginning. In the question of municipal administrations, it has to go all the way back to the person who doesn't feel loved, who is struggling for needs, who doesn't feel appreciated or doesn't feel connected to their community, who doesn't know the other people in their community, who is trying to impose the way they think the world should be because they think that's the only good way the only way the world could be good. If instead they become part of others' lives and begin to see all the ways that the world can be good. And, traveling around the world, if one is able to do international travel, to see the ways that the world can be good in other countries, instead of the ingenious ways that people are victimizing each other. I don't know why it keeps coming to mind, but I did some searching once on the historical figure of, I think his name was Oliver Cromwell, if I remember right. He and the Puritans ruled England for 15 years, I believe. And I think it was Cromwell. And because they wanted to do this moral purification of the country, that's the reason we don't have William Shakespeare's theater anymore, because it was torn down during that time, and there is no remnant of it. Everybody reveres William Shakespeare, but we don't have his theater because the Puritans tore it down. Whatever happened during those 15 years was so oppressive and so victimizing that after Cromwell left power, some other group came to power, Cromwell died. After all of that time, Cromwell was so hated that they exhumed his corpse, put it on trial, hung it for 3 days, then dismembered it, and nobody knows, and scattered the pieces to the four winds, and nobody knows what happened to the head. And I have to wonder what Cromwell did that was so horrific that people hated him enough to do that, to put a corpse on trial for 3 days, hang it, and dismember it, and scatter the pieces. And whatever he did during his administration was so horrible that even after his death, people felt the need to vent their emotional anger that much. And I wonder at the extremes of what his behavior must have been, but I also wonder that we would allow anyone to go to those extremes in the first place without loving them, without finding the people who are isolated. And whoever misbehaves, there's a reason they misbehave. They are missing love, they are missing something in their lives. It doesn't mean their negative behavior should be excused. I'm not asking to put anybody off the hook. It does mean that when you see somebody exhibiting negative behavior, strive for a holistic holistic healing. That it's not just enough to lock them away and throw away the key. This is a human being who emotionally and psychologically, and possibly also physically, but at least emotionally and psychologically, is not a whole person. Otherwise they never would have done that in the first place. And if the only thing you attempt is to keep them from hurting anyone else, that is a very narcissistic and arrogant way of behaving. It really doesn't recognize the humanity of that other person. And if you don't recognize the humanity of the other person, you're not recognizing your own humanity either. And I mean, you can't expect your own humanity to be recognized and respected either. It's a symbiotic relationship. Like the person who said there, but for the grace of God go I. That it doesn't stop with simply locking somebody up and throwing away the key, preventing them from ever hurting anyone else. By not healing them, the people who put that person in prison remain unhealed as well. There has got to be a future judicial system, I hope, that not only addresses how people have misbehaved and what needs to be done for to restore the healthy relationships that need to be there, but what that person has experienced that society erroneously overlooked and didn't deal with before, that left them in a broken mental and emotional state. And that's where I come back as we're running out of time here, but the other thing that comes to mind in the midst of all this that I really haven't heard people talking about much is what I would call religious abuse. All the different forms that religious abuse can take, and how religious abuse is adversarial to the experience of true spirituality. That when somebody tells you, you must believe what I believe even if it doesn't work for you, that is religious abuse. When somebody tells you, you have to go through this ritual follow the motions, do the actions, even though it is not, there's nothing genuine about it to you. You are simply acting it out in a way that is nothing but a demonstrated lie. That is religious abuse. When there is not some sort of recognition that you are a unique individual, you experience one gender or another, or experience yourself in transition, or experience yourself as non-binary, all those things still allow you to be connected to that which is greater than yourself, and still allow you to live as fulfilling and growing and learning of life as you can. As a minister for over 40 years, because I think I was 12 the first time somebody asked me for spiritual counsel. It was really quite, I was like, okay, whatever, I hope I say this right. But as a minister for over 40 years, the conclusion that I keep getting pushed back to is that life is primarily about the growth of the soul. And whether or not you believe that you have a soul, there is a non-physical part of yourself that needs to grow and learn from everything it experiences. And the saddest person is the person who experiences and learns nothing. The person who has opportunity to experience it and chooses not to because it might hurt, it's dangerous. All of life is dangerous, and if you are really living, you will hurt. That's where we come back to the traditional marriage vows. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. All of these things are what we commit to each other, to be with each other and help each other through the diversity of experiences that life produces and presents.